Ladies and gentlemen, there's a moment one that many of us don't talk about when you stop responding. You don't yell, you don't explain, you don't defend or plead or even clarify. You just go quiet. And in that silence, something profound happens, the dynamic shifts. Not because you're trying to manipulate or punish, but because you're choosing peace over performance. You're choosing space over chaos. That decision, while simple on the surface, can have an unexpectedly powerful impact on someone who has always relied on your engagement to feel in control. Some people build their sense of power by maintaining control over how others think, feel, or respond. They might not even do it consciously, but they get used to pulling the strings in conversations, making you doubt yourself, feel guilty, over-explain, or question your reality. They thrive when you react. Whether your reaction is anger, confusion, sadness, or a desperate attempt to be understood, it feeds them. It reinforces the unspoken agreement that they get to set the emotional tone, and that you'll always be the one who bends, breaks, or apologizes just to keep the peace. But silence changes the script. When you stop responding, you're no longer participating in the pattern. You've stepped off the emotional merry-go-round, and that's terrifying to someone who has come to expect your energy, your voice, your effort as a given. Not because they love your presence, but because they rely on it to sustain their sense of control. Silence threatens that illusion. It introduces uncertainty, and for someone who depends on dominance or emotional manipulation, uncertainty feels like a loss of power. There's something about silence that feels like a locked door. For people who always assume they'll be able to talk their way back in, press the right buttons, or wear you down into opening up, that door feels offensive. It makes them panic, not because you've hurt them, but because they can no longer access the control they once had over you. Silence becomes a barrier that they can't break through with charm, rage, guilt, or pity. It's firm, it's clean, and above all, it's out of their hands. But it's more than just not talking. It's an energetic withdrawal. You're no longer giving someone the fuel they used to feed off of. You're not giving them your fear, your confusion, your need to be understood. You're not explaining why you're hurt or trying to justify your boundaries. You're not circling the same conversations, hoping this time they'll see your heart more clearly. You've stopped negotiating your worth. This silence isn't cruel. It's sacred. It's the space where you start to hear your own voice again. It's the moment you realize you don't owe access to people who consistently misuse it. It's where you stop fighting to be seen and start standing in the truth that your value doesn't require constant explanation. For people who depend on your emotional labor to feel powerful, your silence is deeply unsettling. It reveals something they don't want to face, that their influence isn't as absolute as they thought, that your presence was a privilege, not a guarantee, and that control built on your participation isn't real control, it's dependency disguised as dominance. They may try to provoke you, they might accuse you of being cold, dramatic, unkind, or selfish, but that's only because your silence has taken away the script they were comfortable with. They don't know how to function without the cues you used to provide. And that's not your responsibility. Silence isn't about playing games or creating confusion. It's about honoring your own nervous system. It's about realizing that peace is not a passive state, it's an active choice. It's not your job to soothe someone who gets anxious when they can't control you. It's not your job to make them comfortable with your boundaries. If someone panics when you go silent, it's not because silence is inherently harmful. It's because your silence exposes their inability to connect in a healthy way. And that exposure can feel like a collapse. But that collapse is theirs to face, not yours to fix. In choosing silence, you're not abandoning the conversation. You're choosing a different kind of communication, one that says, I don't owe you my pain to prove I'm hurt. I don't owe you my voice to validate my boundary. I don't owe you an explanation to justify my departure. That kind of silence is not empty, it's full of truth. It's where your healing begins and their illusion ends. And if they panic, let them. Because that panic is not your burden, it's their reckoning. Silence has a way of revealing truths that words often cover up. In the absence of noise of justification, explanation, argument, or pleading, something deeper begins to rise to the surface. When you go silent, not out of malice, but out of clarity, the silence becomes a mirror. It doesn't reflect who you are to them. It reflects who they are to themselves. And for some people, especially those who have spent a long time deflecting blame and dodging accountability, that reflection is unbearable. There are individuals who survive emotionally by outsourcing their discomfort. Every time they hurt someone, they find a way to make it about the other person's sensitivity, overreaction, or supposed shortcomings. They've built a version of reality that keeps them safe from self-examination. So long as you're engaging, arguing, defending, crying, explaining, they can twist the story. They can rewrite the narrative and avoid looking at themselves. But when you go silent, you take away their ability to distort. You stop giving them new material to spin. And suddenly, the only thing left is the truth staring back at them. This isn't just about withholding your voice. It's about removing the opportunity for someone to use your reaction as a distraction from their own behavior. It's about not giving them the excuse to focus on your tone, your words, or your attitude, and instead leaving them alone with the consequences of their actions. Silence removes the escape route. It's where the cycle ends not with a dramatic confrontation, but with an absence that echoes louder than any argument ever could. Some people cannot sit in silence because they are terrified of what it will say to them. When there is no more deflection, no more manipulation, no more emotional clutter, they are forced to face a version of themselves they've spent years avoiding. Silence doesn't attack them. It doesn't point fingers or assign blame. It just sits there calmly holding up a mirror. And for someone used to controlling the story, that kind of honesty is deeply unsettling. They might try to break the silence with anger or guilt or performative regret. They might try to provoke you, anything to get you to speak again. Because once you start talking, they can regain their footing. They can pick apart your words, focus on your delivery, or shift the topic. But as long as you stay quiet, they're left with only their own reflection, and that reflection might not be as flattering as the one they've crafted in their mind. Silence is not passive. It is an active, intentional space. It takes immense courage to hold it, especially in relationships where you've been conditioned to believe that silence equals disconnection or danger. But the truth is, silence can be the most powerful form of connection to yourself. It allows you to step out of the exhausting role of emotional caretaker, where you're constantly managing someone else's feelings and instead tend to your own. It creates room for self-respect, for clarity, for boundaries that don't need to be shouted to be understood. And in that quiet space, the dynamics become clear. You start to see who only listens when you're yelling, who only pays attention when you're falling apart, who only values your voice when they can use it against you. The silence reveals who is ever really hearing you at all. What makes silence so potent is that it doesn't allow for performance. When you're quiet, you're not feeding into the dynamic that allowed dysfunction to hide in plain sight. You're not entertaining the illusion that if you just said it the right way or tried a little harder, they'd finally get it. You've released the burden of trying to make someone understand what they were never willing to acknowledge. And that release, while freeing for you, is destabilizing for them. People who rely on your reactions to avoid looking inward panic when you take those reactions away. Not because they're confused by your silence, but because deep down they understand exactly what it means. It means they've been seen. It means they're being held accountable, not through confrontation, but through the withdrawal of the very energy they depended on to maintain the facade. Silence becomes the consequence not of punishment, but of truth. And the mirror that silence holds up, it's not cruel, it's honest. It doesn't exaggerate, it doesn't dramatize, it simply reflects. Some will look away, some will shatter the mirror. But that's not your concern. Your role was never to fix someone else's self-image. Your role was to find your own. In a world that demands constant communication, choosing silence can feel radical. But it is in that radical act that we reclaim our power. We stop performing. We stop chasing validation. We stop managing someone else's discomfort at the expense of our own peace. We allow silence to do what it does best, expose what words can hide. And for those who can't handle the reflection, let them look away. Because the silence you're holding, it's not empty. It's full of boundaries, full of clarity, full of the strength it takes to say without saying anything at all, this is where I end and you begin. For a long time, many of us are taught that silence means weakness. That to be silent is to give up, to lose. That if we care, we fight, we speak, we argue, we try harder. But what that belief often misses is the emotional toll of constant engagement. It misses the moments when silence isn't retreat, it's reclamation. When you go quiet after being pushed, blamed, dismissed, or devalued, it's not because you're out of words. It's because you finally realize your energy is too sacred to waste on someone who never really heard you in the first place. Self-respect doesn't always come with loud declarations. Sometimes it shows up in the stillness of your absence, in the space you no longer fill with justifications, defenses, or emotional labor. It shows up in your refusal to beg for clarity from someone who was never committed to giving you honesty. It's in how you walk away from dysfunction without slamming the door because you don't need the noise. You just need the peace that follows. The thing is, some people don't notice your worth until you stop offering it so freely. When you go silent, it unsettles them not because you're being cruel, but because your silence is communicating something they can't unhear. You've chosen yourself. You're no longer waiting for them to come around, to recognize your value, to treat you with the kindness and respect you always deserved. You've stopped handing over your dignity in the name of keeping the peace. That's not abandonment. That's growth. When you've been in unhealthy dynamics, silence feels foreign at first. You're used to trying harder, giving more, saying something, anything to repair the connection. But over time, you start to see that not every silence needs to be filled. Not every situation deserves your voice. And that withholding your words can actually be the highest form of self-love. Choosing silence is not the same as giving up. It's about knowing the difference between what's worth your time and what's been draining it. It's about recognizing when conversations have become performances where the goal isn't understanding but control. When someone keeps pulling you into the same emotional loop, disrespect, blame, guilt, temporary relief, repeat your silence breaks that cycle. It says, I'm not playing anymore. It says, I value myself too much to stay in this dance. And it's not easy. Self-respect rarely is. It means tolerating the discomfort of being misunderstood. It means sitting with the urge to explain, to defend, to prove you're not the villain. But over time, you realize that someone who's committed to misunderstanding you will twist your words no matter how carefully you choose them. That's when silence becomes your freedom. You don't have to argue with someone who's not listening. You don't have to fix what you didn't break. You don't have to lose yourself in the process of trying to make someone else feel comfortable. There is dignity in disengagement. There is strength in walking away without needing to burn everything down on your way out. Silence doesn't mean you don't care. It means you've stopped caring more than they ever did. It means you've stopped begging for scraps of decency from people who should have cherished your presence. It means you've remembered that your voice is powerful and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not use it. For the person on the receiving end, your silence may feel jarring. They may interpret it as anger or manipulation. But that's not your responsibility. Your job isn't to manage their interpretation of your boundary. Your job is to honor yourself, to protect your peace, to stop allowing someone else's inability to respect you dictate how you show up in the world. Eventually, silence stops feeling like a reaction and starts feeling like a decision. A deliberate, grounded choice, not to hurt anyone else, but to finally stop hurting yourself. It's not about withholding love. It's about redirecting that love back to the one person who's needed it most all along you. And if anyone ever makes you feel guilty for going quiet, remember this respect is a two-way street. If your silence is uncomfortable for them, it's likely because your voice was being used in a way that didn't serve you. You were giving too much, speaking too much, fighting too hard for someone who wasn't meeting you halfway. Silence is not the absence of care. It's the presence of self-worth. It's the quiet confidence that says, I don't need to explain who I am. I just need to be it. That is what self-respect sounds like. And sometimes it sounds like nothing at all. There comes a moment when the most courageous thing you can do is nothing, not react, not reach out, not respond, just stop, not because you don't care, but because you've realized that care without reciprocity becomes a trap. And when you've been caught in a cycle of emotional chaos, one that feeds on your reactions, your empathy, your confusion, your hope, the only way to free yourself is through silence. Silence in this context isn't passive, it's revolutionary. It's the moment you say, this ends with me. For anyone who's lived through patterns of manipulation, blame shifting, gaslighting, or emotional volatility, you know how easy it is to get pulled in. Every message demands a reply. Every accusation feels like a hook. Every insult, every half-hearted apology, every guilt trip, it's all bait. And because you're a person who wants peace, who wants to be understood, who believes in growth and communication, you engage. Over and over, you engage, you explain yourself, you try to find common ground. You think maybe this time it will land, but it doesn't. Because the cycle doesn't exist to resolve things. It exists to maintain control. It's not about clarity, it's about confusion. It's not about closeness, it's about power. And the longer you participate, the more drained you feel. Not just mentally, but emotionally, physically, spiritually. You start losing pieces of yourself, doubting your intuition, questioning your reality, negotiating your boundaries. And that's exactly what the cycle wants. Because as long as you're trying to fix it, you're still in it. This is where silence becomes a lifeline. Not silence as punishment, but silence as protection. When you stop responding, you stop feeding the dysfunction. You stop giving your energy to a system that only takes. Silence becomes the space where you can finally hear your own thoughts, feel your own feelings, and decide what's true for you without the constant interference of someone else's narrative. And for the person who's used to controlling the rhythm of the relationship, your silence is disorienting. When you don't react, they lose their grip. They don't know what you're thinking, what you're feeling, or what you'll do next. That unpredictability scares them. Not because they care about your well-being, but because they can no longer steer your behavior. They're not panicking because you're gone. They're panicking because you've stopped dancing to their tune. Silence breaks the cycle because it removes the fuel. It denies access to the very thing the pattern relies on, your participation. It's in the moment you stop arguing that the dynamic begins to collapse. It's in the moment you stop defending yourself that the power imbalance begins to shift. And it's in the moment you stop hoping for a different outcome that you start creating one for yourself. Of course, this doesn't mean silence is easy. It can be incredibly painful, especially when your instinct is to reach out, to fix, to soothe, to smooth over. There's grief in silence, grief for the connection you tried so hard to save, grief for the energy you gave so freely, grief for the version of yourself that tolerated what you now know was unacceptable. But within that grief is also strength, because silence gives you the gift of distance. And distance gives you perspective. It allows you to see the pattern for what it really was, not a relationship built on mutual respect, but a loop of control, confusion, and conditional affection. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. You realize that no amount of effort will ever make someone treat you better if their goal was never to treat you well in the first place. Silence also teaches you something invaluable. You don't have to attend every emotional fire you're invited to. You don't have to prove your point, justify your boundary, or explain your absence. Sometimes the most powerful statement is no statement at all, just presence, just stillness, just the quiet confidence that says, I know who I am and I don't need to argue about it. Eventually, the silence that once felt so heavy starts to feel like peace, the space that felt empty begins to feel expansive. You fill it with your own voice, your own values, your own healing. And the more you honor that silence, the more you realize breaking the cycle was never about changing them. It was about changing what you're willing to accept. That's the moment you reclaim your power, not through confrontation, but through disengagement. Through the simple, profound act of refusing to play a role in a story that was never with your best interest in mind. You don't need the last word. You don't need to prove them wrong. You just need to be done. And that's the beauty of silence. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand. It just ends what needed to end. Quietly, finally. Completely.